September 1944. Along the western frontier of Germany, the Siegfried Line stands as a monument to calculation, hundreds of miles of concrete, steel, and conviction. Deep within its bunkers, German officers walk the narrow corridors, their boots echoing against walls nearly 4 meters thick. They trace fingers along the smooth grey surface of reinforced ceilings, confident that no weapon in the Allied arsenal can reach them here. The air smells of oil and cement. Engineers carry blueprints rolled beneath their arms, their margins filled with proud arithmetic, angles of resistance, concrete density, steel lattice spacing, the mathematics of invincibility. No Allied shell can touch this, one officer remarks, his words steady, absolute. For years, these fortifications have endured everything the world could throw at them. They are not just walls, they are a statement that German science can outlast Allied fire. But at dawn, the ground betrays that confidence. A tremor passes beneath the floor, subtle at first, then deep, rolling, alive. Instruments rattle, dust falls from the ceiling. It is not the steady rhythm of artillery, it is something heavier, slower, more deliberate. One officer steadies himself against the wall. Another reaches for the phone, but the line is dead. Outside, the horizon flashes once, then again, light without sound. Observation posts vanish in silence. When the thunder finally arrives, it is not the sharp crack of cannon fire, but a low, sustained roar that rolls through the soil like a buried storm. Concrete shudders. Steel shutters bend outward, bolts shear like soft metal. Minutes later, the inspection tunnels are gone. The eternal bunkers of the Siegfried Line collapse inward, their proud geometry undone by a force they cannot measure. Smoke rises through fractures in the earth. Survivors stumble into daylight, dazed, clutching helmets streaked with dust. One officer looks to the sky, listening for the sound that should have warned them. But there was none, only silence, then ruin. He turns to no one in particular and whispers, "What was that? It came from nowhere." Far beyond the horizon, the answer is already loading its next shell. 20 miles from the shattered bunkers of the Siegfried Line, hidden beneath a forest of camouflage netting, an enormous shape waits in silence. Its barrel points toward the horizon, steady and patient. The 240 meters M1 Howitzer, the largest mobile field gun the United States Army has ever built. To the untrained eye, it looks like an industrial relic, a machine too heavy to move and too cumbersome to matter. But within that stillness lies something ancient, the power to shake the earth itself. Each shell is a giant in its own right, 360 pounds of steel and explosive, built to penetrate fortresses that claim to be invulnerable. The barrel alone weighs nearly 8 tons, its rifling carved with surgical precision. To move it requires cranes, tractors, and a ritual of patience. The men who serve it know they are not handling a weapon. They are awakening a force. When the order comes, the silence breaks. The crew steps back. A flash, a thunderclap, and the horizon itself seems to recoil. The howitzer kicks against the ground, its wheels lifting for a moment as if alive, as if rejecting the violence it just delivered. The recoil drives deep into the soil, leaving behind a crater not from the shell, but from the weapon's own defiance of physics. Soldiers instinctively take a step back, steadying themselves against the concussive wave that rolls through their chests. The projectile disappears into the distance, unseen, unheard, until somewhere far ahead, concrete folds, steel bends, and earth itself convulses. What follows is not just destruction, but revelation. The 240 mm M1 does not fire to kill. It fires to demonstrate, to prove that nothing built by human hands can be made invincible. In its calm aftermath, smoke drifts through the trees, and the men move to reload. They do so wordlessly, each motion part of a choreographed silence. The weapon is slow, deliberate as history itself. It will not hurry because it does not need to. German officers had built walls to outlast time. America had built an answer that erased it, but the men who fired it knew this was only the beginning. The dragon had just awakened, and its shadow was still spreading toward the next fortress. Before the Siegfried Line trembled, the weapon had already spoken elsewhere. Months earlier, on the Italian coast, its voice was first heard, low, distant, and absolute. At Anzio, American engineers gathered in secrecy, studying a gun that few outside the Ordnance Department even knew existed. They recorded everything: barrel pressure, humidity, wind resistance, shockwave behavior. Each variable mattered. Each equation was the difference between impact and failure. A single shell was enough to prove the theory. Fired across the coastal plain, it struck a reinforced bunker built to German wartime specifications. 6 feet of concrete, steel rebar woven tight as armor. When the smoke cleared, the bunker was gone. What remained were fragments of data: entry angle, fragmentation pattern, energy transfer. The numbers confirmed what the engineers already suspected. They had built a weapon that could erase fortifications designed to outlast history. The testing ended as quietly as it began. The 240-meter howitzer was disassembled, loaded onto transports, and shipped north. From Italy to France, it moved in silence, its presence disguised beneath camouflage tarps and coded manifests. It traveled not as a symbol of power, but as a calculation in motion, a solution waiting for its problem. By the time it reached the battlefields of Western Europe, its reputation preceded it in whispers. Allied infantry rarely saw the weapon itself. It operated miles behind the lines, shrouded in distance and secrecy. But they knew when it was near. The sound of its firing was unlike any other, a deep, rolling thunder that carried for miles, slow and deliberate, as if the earth itself exhaled. When that sound faded, the path ahead was always clearer. To the Germans, it felt like divine punishment. Bunkers that once defied every assault were suddenly leveled without warning. They called it Der Schwarze Drache, the Black Dragon, a name born not from what they saw, but from what they could not see. And as the thunder rolled north toward the Rhine, one truth became impossible to ignore. The age of the fortress was ending, and the weapon to end it had already begun its march. The story of the 240mm howitzer begins long before its first shot, not in a battlefield, but in an idea. After the horrors of World War I, Europe rebuilt not with hope, but with fear. Across a continent still scarred by trenches and craters, military architects began to pour that fear into concrete. They believed that walls could prevent the return of chaos. The French built the Maginot Line, a labyrinth of steel doors, underground railways, and gun emplacements stretching hundreds of miles. Germany responded with its own network, the Siegfried Line, a mirror of concrete teeth facing west, defiant and permanent. And along the coasts of Norway, France, and the Low Countries, the Atlantic Wall rose, a barrier of pillboxes and gun batteries meant to halt any invasion before it began. These fortresses were not merely defenses. They were symbols. They embodied an engineer's conviction that geometry could replace imagination, that a well-poured bunker could defeat innovation itself. European strategists trusted the endurance of matter more than the adaptability of mind. Every slab of reinforced concrete was a reassurance, every steel girder a prayer against the unknown. When Hitler came to power, he inherited this faith and elevated it to dogma. To him, fortifications were not just military assets, They were ideology made visible. He called them ewige Symbole des deutschen Willens, eternal symbols of German will. Concrete became confidence. Rebar became belief. Germany poured millions of tons of both into its borders, convinced that no enemy would dare to challenge such permanence. But across the Atlantic, the United States saw a different lesson in those same walls. American ordnance officers knew that conventional artillery could not pierce fortresses designed for the last war. Every existing gun, from the 105 meters to the 155 meters, was too light, too short-ranged, too small for the new scale of defense. If the Allies were to break into Fortress Europe, they would need something the world had never seen before, a weapon not of speed, but of gravity. In 1942, inside the quiet offices of the U.S. Army Ordnance Department, a proposal was signed, Heavy Artillery Project No. 240. Its goal was not only to destroy fortifications, but to dismantle the very idea that concrete could outlast courage. Engineers and physicists were told to think without restraint, to imagine a shell so large that it could tear apart what ideology had built. For centuries, men had trusted walls to protect them. Now, a new generation of engineers set out to prove that even the strongest wall could be made to fall. And in the factories of Bethlehem and Watervliet, the first blueprints of that reckoning began to take shape. The quiet birth of a weapon that would turn faith in concrete into dust. The order arrived in 1942, typed in the formal language of the U.S. Ordnance Department, but carrying an impossible demand: build a gun that can move, and still destroy a fortress. The challenge went to the Bethlehem Steel Company, a name already synonymous with America's industrial muscle, but this was no ordinary assignment. What they were being asked to create was something between a cannon and a cathedral, an instrument of precision wrapped in the weight of a mountain. The blueprints began as sketches on long rolls of drafting paper. Engineers debated barrel length, recoil energy, and transport design. Every solution revealed a new problem. A gun large enough to breach German fortifications would also be too heavy for any standard road, too powerful for its own chassis. Mobility itself became the true enemy. Yet slowly, line by line, Bethlehem's engineers began to outline a weapon that defied both logic and limitation: the 240 meters M1 Howitzer. At over 64,000 pounds assembled, it could not travel whole. 2 M6 high-speed tractors were assigned to move it, one towing the barrel, the other its carriage. Once at position, cranes lifted and aligned the components like pieces of a sacred machine. Setting it up required 2 hours of concentration and quiet. No shouting, no haste, only sequence and precision. The ritual never changed. Every bolt, every locking pin was part of a ceremony older than war itself, the fusion of man and metal in pursuit of impossible strength. Its tolerance was measured not in inches, but in thousandths of one. A fraction too loose, and recoil would destroy it. A fraction too tight, and the barrel would split under its own fury. The crews who trained to serve it learned respect before they learned procedure. In the desert of Yuma and the fields of Aberdeen, they practiced in the heat until the weapon felt alive beneath their hands. They came to see it not as a tool, but as something with presence, patient, heavy, and absolute. The weapon's cost was staggering, in materials, in transport, in manpower, but its effect would justify every ton of steel, every gallon of fuel, every man-hour of labor. America had built the slowest, most deliberate, and most devastating field gun in its history, a siege engine disguised as artillery, designed to erase what the modern age had promised to make eternal. When the first completed gun left the Bethlehem plant, workers gathered to watch the convoy pull away, its barrel shrouded under canvas, It looked almost like a living thing sleeping on its side. No one there could have known that within a year, this quiet piece of machinery would rewrite the limits of fortification and faith alike. And as the convoy rolled west toward the proving grounds, one truth was already clear. The age of the wall had just met its architect of ruin. While American engineers forged a weapon in secrecy, Germany fortified itself in concrete. By 1943, Adolf Hitler's empire had transformed the map of Europe into a fortress, a lattice of strongpoints, bunkers, and batteries, stretching from the Arctic Circle to the Mediterranean Sea. He called it Festung Europa, Fortress Europe. Its purpose was both physical and psychological, to convince the world, and perhaps himself, that the Reich could never be breached. From Norway's fjords to the cliffs of Normandy, and deep into the forests along the western frontier, the Reich poured millions of tons of concrete. Each bunker was designed to outlast the storm, its roof thick with steel reinforcement, its walls lined with gun ports angled to trap advancing troops. Some were positioned on coastlines to resist invasion, others buried inland to protect the heart of Germany itself. Hitler's engineers believed they were building immortality. The doctrine was simple. Where men could not hold, walls would. Wehrmacht planners envisioned every fortress as a self-contained organism, able to survive isolation, withstand artillery, and drain the enemy's will through attrition. "Let the Allies bleed on our walls," they wrote in their memoranda, certain that industrial might could replace imagination. The trauma of 1918 still haunted them. They remembered the endless trenches, the stalemates, the slow collapse. Fortress Europe was their answer, a world encased in armor. But every wall carries a flaw, the belief that the next war will be like the last. The Siegfried Line, the Atlantic Wall, the fortress cities of Metz and Brest, all were engineered to repel the 150mm shell, the standard measure of destruction since the Great War. Their blueprints never accounted for something greater, something beyond the known limits of artillery physics. While German architects calculated angles of resistance, American ordnance officers were already designing a projectile that could ignore those equations entirely. In meeting rooms in Berlin, optimism hardened into arrogance. Hitler demanded more fortresses, more concrete, more faith. He declared that no enemy will cross our walls, unaware that the foundations of that promise were already crumbling beneath the weight of innovation. The Allies were not planning to go around Fortress Europe. They were preparing to go through it. And so, two visions of warfare began to converge. One built on immovable stone, the other on unstoppable force. One believed in permanence, the other in progress. The engineers of the Reich trusted in geometry. The engineers of America trusted in gravity. The stage was set for a collision between belief and reality, between walls that thought themselves eternal and a weapon designed to remind them that nothing built by man lasts forever. And far from the front, in the quiet fields of England and France, the black barrels of the 240mm Howitzers waited, patient, motionless, and certain that their moment was coming. The 240mm howitzer was not defeated by the enemy. Its first adversary was gravity. Every part of it, from the massive barrel to the steel carriage, carried the defiant weight of its own purpose. Fully assembled, it pressed into the earth like a monument rather than a machine. Roads cracked beneath it, bridges shuddered at its approach. In towns and fields across Europe, it was as if the weapon announced itself, not with sound, but with pressure. Moving it required calculation, patience, and faith. Engineers studied each route as if planning a campaign of its own. Bridges were reinforced with timber, culverts widened, and fields graded flat to bear its burden. When the convoy advanced, villagers stopped to watch in silence. The gun crawled through their streets at barely 5 miles per hour, flanked by 2 high-speed tractors dragging its halves, the barrel in one, the carriage in another. It was less a weapon in motion than a pilgrimage of steel. Once at its firing position, the ritual began. The crew, 14 men in total, moved with a rhythm born of repetition. The cranes lifted the 8-ton barrel, suspended it in air like a pendulum, then eased it onto its mount with the precision of surgery. Bolts aligned within thousandths of an inch, each piece locked with a metallic sigh. It took 2 hours to prepare for a single shot, but when the moment came, no one rushed. The weapon would not tolerate haste. Those who served it spoke of the gun with reverence. "We didn't command it," one artilleryman remembered. "We served it." The weapon demanded discipline, and in return, it offered certainty, a certainty that when it fired, nothing on earth could stand before it. The men learned its moods, how the barrel's pitch changed in cold air, how the recoil shifted the soil beneath their boots, how the silence before each blast felt almost like the world holding its breath. Critics back home questioned its practicality. They called it too heavy, too slow, too limited for modern war. But the men who saw it fire disagreed. They had watched the impossible happen. Concrete turned to dust, steel torn like paper, enemy positions erased with mathematical precision. Every shot was proof that power, when guided by patience, could alter the very landscape of battle. The moment of firing was unlike anything else in the war. The crew stood clear. A final command, a breath, a pause. Then, thunder. The recoil drove the gun deep into the ground, lifting its wheels clear of the earth. The surrounding soil trembled, stones rolled from nearby walls. A wave of force rippled outward, leaving men momentarily deaf, hearts racing. The shell itself, 360 pounds of steel and explosive, vanished into the horizon, carrying with it the memory of creation and collapse. In the silence that followed, dust settled slowly around the weapon, like a curtain closing after a performance. The crew moved again, wordless, reloading, resetting, recalculating. There was no celebration, no cheers, only the quiet satisfaction of precision fulfilled. They understood what few others did. This was not a field gun. It was something greater. It was a controlled earthquake, engineered to turn the illusion of permanence into a memory. And soon, its tremors would be felt not only in the soil of Europe, but in the minds of those who once believed that walls could not fall. February 1944. The Italian winter clings to the mountains like armor. Clouds hang low over Monte Cassino, a monastery perched on a summit that has stood for 14 centuries, a fortress of faith turned fortress of war. Below it, the Liri Valley stretches in ruin. For months, Allied divisions have battered the slopes, clawing at the rock, while German paratroopers, the elite of the Wehrmacht, hold firm among the rubble. Every assault fails. Every bombardment seems to strengthen the mountain's defiance. The abbey, once a sanctuary of monks and manuscripts, has become the crown of a defensive system known as the Gustav Line, a chain of concrete bunkers and caves carved into the Italian hills. To the Allies below, Cassino is more than a position. It is a symbol, the mountain that stops armies. Air raids have reduced the monastery to stone dust, but the defenders remain alive beneath it, sheltered in bunkers so deep that even direct hits echo without effect. And so, the Americans bring forward their heaviest weapon. On a field 12 miles away, the 240-meter howitzer is unlimbered and leveled toward the mountain. The crews work in silence, each man aware that this gun is not designed for suppression or terror. It is designed for conclusion. Range tables are adjusted, wind speeds measured, coordinates whispered between officers. The barrel lifts, steady as an iron telescope aimed at heaven. The first shell leaves the barrel with a sound that has no comparison, a low, resonant concussion that bends the air itself. The recoil shudders through the gun platform, through the earth, through the bones of the men who stand behind it. The shell arcs unseen into cloud and mist. A heartbeat later, the peak of Monte Cassino erupts. The mountain seems to inhale and then exhale stone. From below, Allied soldiers pause in their trenches. They do not cheer. They simply watch the summit vanish behind a wall of smoke that blooms and settles like volcanic ash. One by one, the Howitzers fire again. The rhythm is deliberate, patient, each shell a hammer blow guided by calculation. The abbey that once defied time begins to dissolve under the arithmetic of American engineering. Inside the German lines, panic replaces precision. Radio messages break mid-sentence. Positions that survived 100 air raids collapse in seconds. The paratroopers, men once called the toughest in the Reich, now fight against the mountain itself, against debris, collapsing ceilings, and the air forced from underground tunnels. One survivor would later write, "It was as if the earth had turned against us." By nightfall, the echoes fade. Smoke drifts in the valleys like fog, the monastery reduced to outlines and memory. When Allied observers climb the next day, they find the stronghold silent. The German resistance has fractured. The line that was supposed to hold Italy forever has cracked. Cassino falls not with ceremony, but with exhaustion. The fortress that began as faith and became fortification ends as dust. In its ruins lies the proof that even the most sacred stronghold cannot outlast the precision of progress. For the men who fired the 240 mm, the result is measured not in triumph, but in understanding. They have witnessed what their creation can do, how a single weapon can turn belief into debris. Monte Cassino becomes more than a battle. It becomes a prophecy, a warning to every wall that mistakes mass for permanence. And far to the north, beyond the Alps and the Rhine, Germany's true fortresses wait, unaware that the weapon that destroyed a mountain is already on its way to meet them. Summer, 1944. On the western edge of France, where the Atlantic winds cut against granite cliffs, stands the fortress city of Brest. Once a proud naval base of the German Kriegsmarine, it has become a final bastion of resistance. Its commander, General Hermann Bernhard Ramke, a paratrooper by blood, a zealot by conviction, vows to hold it until the last man. He believes his walls, carved from stone and steel, will make him immortal. The Allies, advancing after the breakout from Normandy, encircle the city. The siege begins. American bombers darken the sky above Brest, unleashing ton after ton of explosives. The raids shake the harbor, flatten the streets, and scorch the hillsides. But when the smoke clears, the German positions still stand. Deep in casemates built into the coastal rock, machine guns and artillery return fire as though untouched. Even naval bombardment from offshore fails to break through. For weeks, progress stalls. The city that was supposed to fall in days becomes a bleeding wound on the Allied timetable. Ramke's fortress holds, and with every failed assault, his legend grows. To the defenders inside, it feels as if the Reich's promise of invincibility has taken physical form in the concrete that surrounds them. Then, one morning, the ground outside the city begins to move. Beneath camouflage nets, under the cover of rain and dust, the Americans bring forward their heaviest answer, the 240 mm howitzer. Each piece arrives disassembled, its barrel and carriage dragged separately by tractors through cratered roads. Within hours, the crews assemble it on prepared platforms, calibrating their aim with quiet precision. The weapon that had shattered mountains now turns its attention to a fortress by the sea. The first shell, lands with a sound that defies memory. The blast folds the earth, lifting the roofs of nearby positions like tin lids. The casemates that had resisted bombs and naval shells begin to open like cracked eggs. Concrete that took months to pour disintegrates in seconds. Within the city, even the most hardened veterans stare at each other, disbelieving. The fortress that had withstood fleets now trembles under the weight of a single battalion. Each salvo brings a new silence. Machine guns that once raked the Allied lines fall mute. Command posts vanish without trace. German engineers, who once calculated angles of fire with mathematical pride, now sit in the dark and listen to the walls groan. Rumors spread faster than reports. The Americans have a new weapon. Panic replaces doctrine. General Ramke clings to his oath, urging his men to fight on. But the meaning of defiance has changed. The walls he trusted have turned against him. Each impact sends shockwaves through bunkers once thought unbreakable. His fortress, his faith, is dying from within. After weeks of resistance, the inevitable comes. On September 19, 1944, Ramke surrenders. His officers describe him as silent, stunned, his pride stripped bare by the evidence around him. The great fortress of Brest lies in ruin. What entire air fleets failed to destroy, a single artillery group, methodical, patient, unseen, has erased with precision and pressure. When Allied engineers walk through the wreckage, they find bunkers peeled open like the cross-sections of anatomy. Every inch of German construction, every ton of concrete and rebar has been tested and found wanting. Brest is no longer a fortress. It is a message. The myth of fortress warfare, of strength through immobility, of courage encased in concrete, lies shattered beside the Atlantic. From this point on, generals will think twice before trusting walls to do what men cannot. And far to the east, along the Siegfried Line, other German officers begin to whisper the same question that once echoed through Cassino. If Brest has fallen, what hope do our fortresses have? Autumn, 1944. The Rhine River glimmers in the distance, the last great barrier between the Allies and the heart of Germany. Stretching before it lies a wall that had haunted Allied intelligence for years, the Siegfried Line, or West Wall as the Germans called it. 18,000 bunkers, pillboxes, and dragon's teeth snake across 390 miles of forest and field, from the Netherlands to Switzerland. It is more than a defensive system. It is Germany's final illusion of permanence. Each position is a monument to engineering. 4 meters of reinforced concrete, reinforced roofs of steel, I-beams, weapon ports angled for maximum field of fire. For the men inside, it feels indestructible. For the men outside, it looks eternal. Allied soldiers approach it with a sense of resignation, expecting another Cassino, another Brest. Commanders speak of months of siege, of slow, costly grinding through the wall. But this time, something different waits behind the artillery lines. The 240mm howitzer, the slow-moving giant born from America's laboratories of patience, is rolled into position. Its crews, veterans now, move with the precision of habit. Range tables are updated, atmospheric readings taken. For each bunker, an exact calculation is made. The elevation, the barrel's angle, the expected recoil. It is mathematics turned to prophecy. When the first salvo comes, it is not the beginning of battle, it is the end of an era. The shells strike with such force that observation posts vanish without sound. Bunkers collapse inward as if crushed by invisible hands. The concrete that had taken months to pour disintegrates in seconds. Its fragments hurled hundreds of feet. Infantrymen watching from the tree line stare in disbelief. The impossible, one private mutters, has become routine. Across the Siegfried Line, German officers scramble to make sense of it. Communications break down as command posts disappear. Crews try to man guns buried in rubble. Others flee, thinking they've been hit by a new type of bomb. The 240 meters range, over 25,000 yards, means its origin remains unseen. To the defenders, the destruction feels like divine judgment, a storm that falls from nowhere. For American troops, the Howitzers' thunder becomes a prelude to every advance. Engineers mark targets with white tape. Artillerymen follow with fire. When the shells stop, infantry moves forward, not into traps, but through open ground where the walls have already been erased. The rhythm becomes familiar, almost mechanical. Calculate, fire, advance, repeat. A doctrine of destruction replaces a doctrine of defense. In the ruins, there is no pattern left to understand. Concrete slabs rest upside down, rebar twisted like roots. The Siegfried Line, which had been a point of pride for the Reich since 1938, now resembles an archaeological site, the remnants of a civilization that believed in geometry over adaptability. For the Americans, the emotional weight is different. They do not cheer in triumph, they cheer in relief. For years, the war had been defined by frustration, by the slow bleeding of men against walls that refused to break. Now, for the first time, they watch fortifications crumble as easily as dust. It is not vengeance they feel, but release, the realization that progress is finally possible. From Aachen to Saarbrücken, the thunder rolls on. Each blast echoes through valleys and cities, carrying with it a message that spreads faster than the shells themselves. There are no safe places left. The fortresses once meant to defend the Reich now serve as tombs for its illusions. When the 240-meter falls silent, the infantry moves again, forward, eastward, toward the Rhine. Behind them, the Siegfried Line lies shattered, its purpose gone, its promise broken. What once stood as Germany's shield now marks the beginning of its surrender. And somewhere across the river, within the bunkers of Aachen and Metz, the last German engineers cling to their blueprints, still unaware that the sound approaching them is not just artillery. It is history itself, arriving on the back of thunder. When the 240mm howitzer fired, there was no warning, only aftermath. The shell left the barrel at nearly 2,500 feet per second, arcing into a sky too high and too far for the enemy to hear. By the time the sound of its launch reached the German lines, the explosion had already come and gone. It was a weapon that killed in silence, a strike with no echo. Its range, over 25,000 yards, placed it beyond the limits of perception. For those who faced it, death no longer arrived with the familiar crescendo of incoming fire. Instead, bunkers simply ceased to exist. Observation towers vanished mid-transmission. Steel shutters meant to withstand decades of bombardment tore outward like paper lids. There was no warning whistle, no chance to brace, just pressure, dust, and the realization that nothing could answer back. In the autumn of 1944, the first German city to feel this silence was Aachen. Once a medieval jewel, now a fortress on the frontier, it had become a test of will between two civilizations. Within its ancient walls, engineers and infantrymen took shelter in casemates thought invincible. When the 240 meters opened fire, those walls disintegrated in seconds. The city shook so violently that civilians in basements believed an earthquake had struck. Whole sections of defensive towers collapsed inward, sending shockwaves through streets already emptied of sound. Farther east, at Metz, the story repeated itself. The old fortress system, built by the French, perfected by the Germans, and regarded as indestructible, became the next laboratory of destruction. Here, the Germans had strengthened the defenses with bunkers designed to resist 155 mm fire. Against the 240 mm, they might as well have been glass. One shell struck Fort Bryant with such precision that engineers later found the impact crater where the roof once stood, 8 feet deep, 15 wide, and lined with fragments of twisted steel beams. To the Allies, the weapon's effect seemed almost supernatural. Reports described its impact as surgical brutality. The gun did not fire rapidly, nor did it need to. Each shot was an execution of geometry, an equation solved through patience and recoil. One round was often enough to eliminate an entire position. Officers observing through binoculars watched as pillboxes that had held out for days simply disappeared, replaced by rising columns of dust that marked the end of resistance. Inside the German ranks, disbelief turned to dread. The silence before impact unnerved even the most disciplined soldiers. They listened for warning, for any pattern that could predict the next strike, but there was none. The absence of sound became its own kind of weapon. To fight was to wait, knowing that waiting itself might be the last thing one did. And yet, even in their fear, the Germans recognized something extraordinary. They were not facing mere artillery, but a philosophy of warfare, one that replaced mass with precision, noise with inevitability. Their own doctrine of fortification, born from the geometry of the 1930s, had no answer for this arithmetic of annihilation. The fortress, once a symbol of permanence, had become an anachronism overnight. For the men behind the gun, the experience was equally surreal. They watched their calculations turn into craters from 20 miles away. They never saw the enemy they destroyed. There was no cheering, no triumph, only the quiet recoil, the faint settling of dust, the reloading of the next round. The weapon's power left little room for pride. It demanded respect, and it gave only silence in return. In military reports, generals began using a new phrase, instant demolition. But among the men in the field, another term emerged, sound without echo. It captured not just the weapon's effect, but its meaning. For the first time in human history, destruction had outpaced perception. The enemy could no longer even hear its own defeat. The fortress doctrine did not collapse under pressure. It evaporated, dissolved by mathematics and metal. The engineers who once believed in permanence were left with nothing to measure but loss. And as the smoke drifted eastward, toward the heart of the Reich, another lesson emerged. If silence could destroy walls, what would it do to belief itself? By winter 1944, reports from the Western Front began arriving in Berlin. Short, desperate, and impossible to believe. Fortifications that had taken years to construct were pulverized as by mining explosions. Pillboxes had not been breached, they had been erased. Commanders described entire strongpoints vanishing in single strikes. Engineers begged for explanations, but there were none that fit within the mathematics of their confidence. Inside the Führer's headquarters, the disbelief turned to anger. Hitler, obsessed with the sanctity of his concrete empire, demanded answers. He ordered new bunkers, thicker walls, deeper emplacements, fortresses to outlast the century. But the Reich no longer had the steel, the labor, or the faith to build them. The men who once shaped mountains of concrete now worked beneath them, burying the last illusions of permanence. In the offices of the Todt organization, the same engineers who had once designed the Atlantic Wall and the Siegfried Line, the mood was quieter, almost funereal. One report from a senior planner read simply, "The Americans have rendered our work meaningless." These were not words of surrender, but of realization. The doctrine that had defined Europe's defense for 3 decades had been undone by arithmetic. Across the Western Front, from Metz to Saarbrücken, every fortress fell in sequence. Bunkers that once held divisions now sheltered only fragments. The Allied advance, guided by fire from the 240 mm Howitzers, no longer needed attrition or sacrifice. Walls were mapped, calculated, and removed, methodically, predictably, mercilessly. The German High Command could no longer tell where the front line ended because every fixed position was already gone. For the soldiers inside those fortresses, the experience was not defeat, but disorientation. They had been trained to expect siege, to endure, to wait, to counterattack. But against the silent thunder of the American guns, there was nothing to answer. The 240 meters was not a weapon of battle, it was a verdict. It declared without emotion that the age of fortifications had ended. Historians would later call it a shift in military evolution, the moment strategy yielded to mobility, when static defense became a relic. But for those who lived it, it felt more personal. The men who built the Siegfried Line had believed that strength could be poured, shaped, and measured. The men who destroyed it proved that strength could also move, that precision, not permanence, would define the wars of the future. By early 1945, as Allied forces crossed the Rhine, Germany's landscape was littered with the corpses of its own confidence. Bunkers jutted from hillsides like fossils, empty shells of a vanished faith. No speeches were made for them. No last stands honored their sacrifice. Fortress Europe died without ceremony, not in defeat, but in irrelevance. The 240mm howitzer, meanwhile, had outlived its purpose. Its barrels were worn, its crews exhausted, its mission complete. What remained was not a story of destruction, but of revelation. Technology had once again outpaced belief. In the ruins of Germany's walls lay a warning written in silence. Any power that depends on walls to stand will one day learn that the future moves faster than concrete can cure. And beyond the Rhine, in the quiet of the shattered frontier, American commanders began to ask a new question. If fortresses could die this easily, what else, once thought eternal, could be broken next? May 1945. Across Europe, the guns fall silent. From the ruins of Berlin to the beaches of Normandy, the echoes of artillery fade into memory. The world exhales, slowly, uncertainly. For the men of the U.S. Army's heavy artillery battalions, the end of the war feels less like triumph and more like the closing of a chapter written in steel. On quiet fields near the Rhine, the 240-meter howitzers stand idle. Their barrels, still faintly warm from their final bombardments, point toward a sky that no longer needs them. Crews walk among them with a kind of reverence, hands tracing the oil-blackened metal one last time. For years, these machines had been both burden and companion, too heavy to move easily, too powerful to ignore. Now stripped of purpose, they are monuments to a kind of power that no longer needs to speak. One by one, the crews begin disassembly. The great barrels are unbolted, cradled by cranes, and lowered into waiting tractors. The process is slow, deliberate, almost ceremonial. Men who once loaded shells the size of children now lift smaller tools, working with the care of craftsmen. They do not cheer. They do not take photographs. They move with the calm of those who understand the weight of what they are putting away. Reports filter back to headquarters, technical summaries, written without emotion but heavy with awe. The numbers confirm what the soldiers already know. During its service, the 240mm achieved an astonishing accuracy rate. 80% of rounds landed within a few meters of target. In the hands of trained crews, the gun had become a scalpel, slicing through concrete and calculation alike. Yet that precision had carried a strange cost. The weapon had done its job too well. Across the continent, there were no fortresses left to destroy. The doctrine of static defense, once the pride of generals and engineers, had vanished beneath the weight of its success. In its silence, the howitzer left behind an emptiness not of war, but of meaning. When the guns were shipped home, they did not travel like trophies. There were no parades, no flags draped across their carriages. They returned quietly, stored in depots or left in the open air of American training grounds. Some were tested for future conflicts. Others were scrapped. None fired again in anger. They had proven their worth by making themselves obsolete. For the men who had served them, the memory endured differently. They did not remember the sound of firing. They remembered the stillness after, the moment when the smoke drifted across the fields, when the enemy's walls were gone, and when the earth itself seemed to stop moving. They remembered the silence, deep, clean, and final. Historians would later call the 240mm howitzer the most powerful field artillery piece ever used by the United States in Europe. But those who worked it never used the word power. They preferred respect. The gun demanded it. It consumed time, labor, and patience, and in return, it offered certainty. Even at rest, its presence commanded quiet. As the war ended, its shadow lingered, not in fear, but in reflection. The weapon that had ended the age of walls stood now as a reminder. Technology does not merely change warfare, it changes belief. Every shell fired had carried not just explosive force, but the weight of transition, from an old world built on defense to a new one built on reach. And in that silence after victory, surrounded by dismantled guns and folded maps, a new question took shape. If even the strongest walls could fall, what boundaries would the next weapon choose to erase? In the years that followed the war, military planners gathered in quiet rooms, surrounded by charts, blueprints, and fragments of concrete. They studied the campaign data from France and Germany, tracing the pattern of collapsed fortresses across Europe's map. The results were unmistakable. The walls had not merely been defeated, they had been outdated. The age of fortification, once considered the pinnacle of military logic, had ended in rubble. Across the ruins of the Siegfried Line and the Atlantic Wall, engineers took measurements and photographs not to preserve history, but to understand how belief had failed. The data spoke clearly. No structure, however thick, could resist the accelerating precision of modern firepower. The future belonged to those who could move, not to those who could stand still. Within the U.S. Army's Ordnance Department, the 240mm howitzer became a subject of study, not nostalgia. It was treated as a bridge, a steel threshold between eras. The gun had proven that mathematics and engineering could replace mass and manpower. It had pointed the way toward a new idea, that power was not about fortification, but projection. A weapon that could reach further would always define the battlefield. By the early 1950s, that philosophy took physical form. On a test range in the Nevada desert, another colossal weapon rolled into view, the M65, codenamed Atomic Annie. Its barrel, long and deliberate, carried the unmistakable lineage of the 240mm. But where its predecessor had fired steel and TNT, this new gun carried a different payload entirely, a shell containing an atomic charge. The connection was undeniable. Every lesson learned from the howitzer, the mechanics of recoil, the alignment tolerances, the calibration of range tables, had shaped the birth of atomic artillery. The slow thunder of the past had evolved into a single blinding flash. The howitzer's DNA had been passed forward into a generation of weapons capable of ending not just fortresses, but cities. To the scientists and strategists of the new age, this was progress, inevitable, rational, even necessary. But to the veterans who remembered the smell of the powder and the tremor of the earth, there was something else in the silence. They understood what few dared to say, that the pursuit of security had become inseparable from the creation of destruction. Every wall that fell in 1944 had paved the path toward a future where walls would no longer matter at all. In the military academies, the new doctrine was written simply: mobility and precision define power. The fortress was dead, replaced by deterrence, an idea far colder, far quieter, and infinitely more dangerous. The lesson of the 240 mm was not just technological, it was moral. The gun had proven that no defense is eternal, and that every attempt to make war safer only makes it more absolute. By the end of the decade, the world no longer built bunkers to withstand artillery. It built silos to hold missiles. The walls had not disappeared. They had risen into the stratosphere, invisible, abstract, and apocalyptic. The engineers of the 1930s had built in concrete. The engineers of the 1950s built in atoms. The final irony was complete. The pursuit of defense, the dream of the fortress, the illusion of safety through solidity had birthed the science of annihilation. From the ashes of the Siegfried Line rose the doctrine of nuclear deterrence. The age of walls had ended. The age of reach had begun. In the final year of the war, German officers stood inside their concrete bastions with quiet pride. To them, the walls were more than structures. They were faith made tangible, proof that discipline and engineering could hold back chaos. They had poured their confidence into the molds of reinforced steel, believing that courage could be measured in meters of concrete. They called them fortresses: the Atlantic Wall, the Siegfried Line, the fortress cities, all expressions of the same conviction, that permanence was power, that the world could be defended by calculation, that safety could be built. But war, like history itself, refuses to hold still. It evolves faster than belief. By the autumn of 1944, those walls had become echoes of an older century. The 240 mm howitzer, a weapon of deliberate movement and precise destruction, shattered not only the bastions of Fortress Europe, but the assumptions that created them. Each salvo was a lesson written in dust, that no wall, no matter how thick, could outlast understanding. The German engineers who once drew perfect angles on blueprints now walked through the broken geometry of their own design. The lines they trusted had been erased by mathematics they had never imagined. The sound that reached them from miles away, the slow rolling thunder of the American heavy guns, was not just artillery. It was the sound of certainty collapsing. Even for the victors, the moment carried no triumph. The crews who fired the 240 meters did not cheer. They did not raise flags or claim glory. When the guns fell silent, they simply stood beside their machines, watching the smoke drift away. They had seen the cost of mastery, how progress could turn faith into fragility. For them, history had shifted not with a roar, but with a realization. That power no longer resided in mass, but in mind. The fortresses of Europe, those monuments to fear and confidence alike, now lay scattered across the continent like fossils of a vanished age. In their ruins, future generations would see both arrogance and ingenuity, both the brilliance of design and the blindness of belief. What was once a shield had become a warning. When historians look back, they find more than steel and stone. They find irony. The men who believed walls could save them had built the very foundations that proved the opposite. Their effort to make war predictable had birthed weapons that made it infinite. Their pursuit of security had created the science that would erase the concept entirely. The 240 mm howitzer was not merely a gun. It was a punctuation mark at the end of an era. Its thunder announced that the age of walls was over, replaced by an age where reach mattered more than resistance, where knowledge, not fortification, defined survival. In that truth lies the quiet moral of the war's last artillery piece. No empire falls because its walls are weak. It falls because it forgets that walls are never enough. As the final generation of fortress engineers faded into history, their creations remained only as relics, empty shells beside highways, grass growing through cracks once measured by rulers and pride. The silence around them speaks louder than the gunfire that destroyed them. They believed walls could save them. They never believed again.